Hello, and welcome to our presentation on unlicensed in the 6 gig band, background and key issues. My name is Mark Gibson. I'm Director of Business Development and Spectrum Regulatory Policy for CommScope, CommSearch. We put this together to help folks better understand what's going on in the 6 gig band, what's happening with the allocation, what's happening with the automatic frequency coordinating system, and just in general, what to do and what to watch out for. We'll talk about the regulatory background, how we got here, the background on the proponents, some use cases. We'll talk about the background on microwave incumbents, what microwave incumbents need to concern themselves and worry about, and then finally key issues and what to do next. So the timeline on this began back in August of 2017 when the FCC issued a notice of inquiry asking questions about the whole mid-bands. They called it the C-band, which now has been bifurcated into the 6 gig band and 4 gig band. There were many questions about the C-band, which is what's driven a whole lot of the C-band issues. We're focusing obviously here on the 6 gig band. But what they did is they asked specifically about unlicensed use. There had been a lot of interest in proponents of the unlicensed use of the band, so that's one of the things that got the Commission thinking about that. And then at least in the NOI, they broke the band into two segments, the lower 6, 5925 to 6425, and the upper 6, 6425 to 7125, and those are fairly consistent with international allocations. There were a lot of comments and replies, not many replies, but a lot of comments, and that got the Commission thinking about next steps. Between August and January, actually in January, the proponents of unlicensed, called RLAND proponents, filed a study on the docket by a company called RKF. It was a commission study. And the idea behind that study was to determine the extent to which RLAND devices can coexist. And this was mostly for indoor RLAND devices. We're calling low power indoor. They provided an interesting approach to estimate of RLAND deployment going out to 2025 and actually starting this year, so that was fairly aggressive. But their conclusion was that low-power indoor devices would not cause interference into microwave systems. That conclusion has been disputed substantially on the docket with many studies. In October of 2018, the FCC issued an NPRM, a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, on the unlicensed use of the 6 gig band. And in there, they proposed new rules for sharing. The primary thing they proposed was the automatic frequency coordinating idea, or AFC. And you'll see that just sort of threaded through here. As well as they asked several questions on how sharing can happen, considering things like propagation models, interference protection criteria, building and clutter loss, additional things like what databases to use, how often, and that. There were 108 comments and 63 replies. That's a fairly active docket. In the post-comment period between October and April 2019, there were a lot of ex partes, which is filings when the comment period is closed, a lot of meetings, and a plethora of analysis performed on the record. We did analyses. Many of our customers did analyses. There were analyses provided by the RLAND community, sometimes called 6USC. So the docket was active and full of a lot of studies. Finally, in April of this year, the Commission issued the report and order and the further notice. In the report and order, they provided the rules for the standard power, low power, and client devices, as well as basic rules for the AFC. One of the other things they did is identify, or not identify, but suggest that a lot of the work on the AFC should be done or could be done in a multi-stakeholder group. We'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, they issued a further notice of proposed rulemaking on very low power and low power indoor. So the basics of the rulemaking, or the report and order, is allocated all 1200 megahertz for unlicensed. There had been some proponents asking the Commission to allocate the upper portion above 6425 or above 6525 to mobile licensed use. And all of the incumbents in that portion of the band would be relocated, probably somewhere another spectrum. There was interest in actually opening up the 7125 to 8500 meg band, which is federal exclusive. We'll talk about that another time. That did not carry the day. The other thing they did was the Commission did identify that low power indoor can operate indoors only without an AFC at 5 dBm per megahertz. So that's the maximum power, capped at 30 dBm for 320 megahertz channels. Talk about that in more as we go through here. Standard power access points they identified can operate both indoors and outdoors, but must use the AFC. So there was a lot of interest and activity on the docket about whether low power indoors should operate with or without the AFC. The Commission opined that they can do it without the AFC, but at max of 5 dBm per megahertz. And you'll see in a moment in the further notice, they asked some more questions. They talked about in the order how the AFC should work, identifying the AFC as a geolocation database of available frequencies and powers based on incumbent usage. This is more or less modeled after the TV white space and a little bit after CBRS. No mobility allowed for standard power. They can be nomadic, in other words, they can move around, say at walking speed, but they're not allowed to be mobile like in vehicles, or for that matter for low power indoor. But they can operate standard power, and obviously low power can operate in aircraft above 10,000 feet, except for drones. The idea behind that was the aircraft above 10,000 feet have two things. One, typically they are metal. If they're not metal, they have Faraday cages like the 787. Or they are operating at such a high altitude as to not cause any potential interference for microwave systems. And then they suggest, as I said earlier, the new multi-stakeholder group to study and support development of the AFC requirements as well as interference reporting. So that's a report in order. In the further notice, they asked the question about whether very low power can operate indoors without an AFC across the band at 14 dBm EIRP with neg 8 dBm power spectral density. The other thing they ask about is whether a contention-based protocol can be used to protect incumbents, including mobile incumbents in the Uni 6 and 8. The contention-based protocol is basically a listen before talk protocol. They ask about whether they should increase low-power indoor ERP from fixed 5 dBm per megahertz to a fixed 8 dBm per megahertz, so raising it 3 dB. And then some more issues around power spectral density for given bandwidths. Whether they should permit standard power APs to be mobile, so operate on vehicles, trains. Many people filed from those various areas asking for them to be operable on those types of things. Also operate at higher power, at least for things like point-to-point. Most people may know that the 5.9 gig unibands 1 through 4 are used heavily for point-to-point microwave by WISPs and others. So they're asking whether they can operate with higher gain antennas, whether if they do that, they should operate under professional installation, and whether there needed to be changes to the AFC to support that. So here's a picture of what the 6 gigahertz band looks like with the uni bands identified underneath. So you can see Uni 5 is 5925 to 6425 and above, and see where Uni 4, 1 to 4 exists, and actually where the federal allocation is. Most of the microwave, and you'll see this in a little bit, operates in lower 6 and Uni 7. There's a lot of mobility in the Uni 6 and Uni 8, but that's where most of the operations are in the band. So as far as power limits are concerned, for standard power, the max power is 4 watts and must use an AFC, and they can operate only in Uni 5 and Uni 7. The low power indoor LPI access points can operate at 1 watt for 320 megahertz, so that's a lot of power in 320 megahertz, with a fixed power spectral density of 5 dBm per megahertz across the whole band. Remember, the further notice asks about raising that power, as you see in the one below that. And then finally, the client devices operate at 6 dB below the access points, roughly. So some notes. As I said earlier, the standard power and low power can operate in passenger aircraft operating above 10,000 feet. For standard power operating outdoor, though, because of the concern about interference with satellites, because if you notice the upper portion of the band, remember, has a lot of satellite operation, they limit the power above the horizon at 30 degrees above the horizon to 21 dBm. So they'll have to have limitations on the power, anything pointing up. And so that's pretty much it for that. Here is a picture of what the band plan looks like for the unlicensed devices. So this actually exists now in the lower 5, the 5.9 gig band, but you can see that there are way more 160 meg channels that you can get in 1200 megahertz than you can in the lower 5. And there's also an opportunity of combining 260 meg channels for 320 megahertz channels. The 6 gig Wi-Fi channel plan is shown below. Now this band is usable for way more than just Wi-Fi. It's unlicensed, so it can be used for 3GPP type applications. it can be used for any unlicensed applications. UWB, ultra-wideband, are very interested in these bands. But the primary driving interests were the Wi-Fi people, and so this is one of the reasons they can get a whole lot more operation in this portion of this. So the basics of the AFC from the report and order, you see at the top there is a sort of a notional functional architecture that identifies multiple AFCs. The Commission identified, though, that the AFCs have to operate in a sort of a centralized approach. And basically, it's the way they operate like in TV whitespace or CBRS SAS, where the AFC is telling the device what spectrum is available and generally at what powers. There's some thought that the AFC just provides data. That's not what the Commission said. The AFC is actually doing calculations and providing that information to devices. The whole notion of the centralized approach gives the Commission oversight, basically a handful of necks to squeeze, as opposed to just everybody doing it. But they do want to maintain oversight. That is one way that they need to manage potential for interference into incumbents. The other thing is they believe that the AFC in this instantiation is more simple and quicker to deploy. So we'll see as that moves on. They mandated that the ULS is the database to use. There were some suggestions maybe not to use the ULS, just giving the current state of the ULS being adequate, but maybe not sufficient for, or adequate and sufficient, but not perfect for the AFC operation. But they said the AFC is, or the ULS is the regulatory database, contains all the data. That's not necessarily so because there are data elements missing in the ULS to facilitate the interference calculation, but they can be accommodated. And they put the responsibility of the data in the ULS on the licensees, so that if there's any issues, the regulatory database that is guiding is the ULS. So what they're going to do is they're going to issue a public notice shortly, identifying or giving a time frame for incumbents to come in and update the data in the ULS. And they won't waive any related fees. So if some of those updates require, say, major changes, you may have to file an additional fee. The other thing is that in the microwave bands, as most people are well aware, you can actually go on operation before for temp fixed under an STA or special temporary authority before it gets in the ULS. And if we're using the ULS for the AFC, there's really no way to protect those types of operations, and those operations are certainly primary over unlicensed. So the Commission is going to modify the ULS to allow for those types of temporary fixed stations or stations operating under an STA to actually be in the ULS. So we'll have to watch and see how that happens. We have to protect our neighbors to the north and south. The Commission is going to work with them on how to get their data in the AFC, which will be interesting. And more importantly, the devices must be able to geolocate. So as it is with TV whitespace or CBRS, we have to know where the devices are so we can calculate the interference. So most Wi-Fi devices do not have GPS geolocation. It's an additional expense that's not necessarily needed. So the Commission so the Commission wanted to accommodate multiple ways for doing geolocation, also recognizing that geolocation is a function of the quality of the device, or the geolocation capability, as well as where the device is located. So if the device is located indoors, it's probably not going to be easy to geolocate it. So they've accommodated many ways to do geolocation, even including tethering the device to a smartphone and using the smartphone's geolocation capability. However, all of these geolocation techniques introduce this notion of uncertainty in position. Typically, the position in the XY plane is roughly the same. It can be anywhere from several millimeters or centimeters to many meters, tens of meters. And then the location in the Z-axis is much more difficult using GPS. So those differences give this notion, as you see up there in the upper right, something called an oblate spheroid, which is the device can be located anywhere within that volume. So that complicates a little bit of the interference calculation, trying to determine where the size of that volume and where the device can be. Nonetheless, location uncertainty is going to be a big deal in this. A few more basics. There is no synchronization between AFCs. So as many AFCs as there are, they'll be not talking to each other. The Commission felt like because everything is coming from the ULS and there's nothing going back in, then there's no data that needs to be shared. This is the z-axis thing. The antenna height either has to be provided by the installer or by a geolocation capability, and we haven't really figured out a way to do that. So they punted some of this to the industry groups of the multi-stakeholder. Because of the dynamic nature of the data in the UOS, at least as it relates to microwave systems, which is something we told the commission about, we figure that there are roughly 600 to 800 filings daily in the database, or in the ULS. So, I'm sorry, monthly, and then 21 roughly daily. Since we don't know where those are, you know, it has to be a daily recheck interval. So the device has to check the database once a day. If the device misses checking the database in a given day, it's given another grace period, and if it doesn't do that, it gets deregistered or kicked out or something. We haven't figured out exactly how that's going to work. On the technical side, the commission described propagation models. As you can see here, there's really three propagation sort of multimode approach. For short distances, it'll be free space, that's up to 30 meters. For intermediate distances, is a model called WINNER. WINNER is an acronym that we talked a lot about within the various stakeholder groups. We'll use WINNER between 30 meters and 1 kilometer. And then for interference path links beyond a kilometer, we'll use ITM, or Integrated Terrain Model, which is very similar to Longley-Rice. We'll have to use site-specific information. So we'll need to know the line of sight situation between a device and an interference or in a victim microwave path. And the other thing too is the commission described two approaches to clutter: the ITU P2108 for urban suburban, and then P452 for rural. And though they actually provided those two models in the rulemaking. The interference protection criteria is an I/N of 6 dB, so the interference has to come in at 6 dB below noise. And there's no aggregate effects, which means that the interference protection criteria has to accommodate multiple exposures. So there's some question around that given the profusion of devices, but we'll see how that works out. With respect to adjacent channel interference, just because of the out-of-band emission mask for our land devices, they will need to consider adjacent channels. And, you know, the maximum channels for microwave systems are smaller than the maximum channels for the unlicensed devices, so there'll be a substantial amount of overlap. And what's interesting is because the standard power can operate indoors, they didn't address any built-in entrant loss models for the indoor access points, and there are several. So we'll have to work on that within the multi-state. A little bit more on the AFC. Devices must register, so AFCs have to register, and that's what the device APs have to register. What the AFC will do is authenticate the devices, at least as it relates to the serial number and FCC ID. So this is one way to effectuate some level of security. We need to know that the device has certainly an FCC ID, so that's another database we'll have to deal with at the commission, from the commission, and then a valid serial number, and each serial number for each device is unique. And this interference will be used, this data will be used primarily for interference mitigation and enforcement, which the multi-stakeholder group will have to work on, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The AFC has to store this registration information for up to 3 months. That's again to effectuate the interference mitigation and enforcement. So after 3 months, the data will probably just be overwritten. The AFC operators will have to respond to FCC requests for information. So if interference occurs and the victims call the commission, commission's going to call the AFC operators, and the AFC operators will have to respond. And the majority of the interference identification mitigation has been kicked to the multi-stakeholder group, which we'll talk about in a minute. The security aspects of this is the commission wants to make sure that the AFC systems and the access points are at least as secure as best effort, essentially the same that we're doing with CBRS, so that you know, there's not an opportunity to get in and muck around with devices or with the AFC. So we will be working on that. The statement you see there is lifted from the R&O. And then we have to protect radio astronomy at certain locations identified by the footnote 220 in the table of allocations. And the protection is not just an area. We have to calculate certain azimuths and distances, so we'll have to do that. However, the satellites got no protection from standard power except for the minimum limitation of 21 dBm above the 30-degree elevation angle. So how the AFCs will be selected, the FCC will designate all of them, very similar to what we've done with TB Whitespace and CBRS. They want to be in control of the effort. So they'll issue a public notice, which everybody can review. The public notice will say, you know, please let us know if you want to be an AFC provider. They will list the responsibilities of the AFC. and all the applications get submitted. Most of the applications get redacted, but they will be submitted on the docket so that people can review them. And so once the commission reviews all of them and makes sure that they have the T's crossed and the I's dotted, they'll get conditional approval. That time frame can be as long as a year. For CBRS, it was at least that long, I believe. But nonetheless, we'll get conditional approval. Then we'll go to a public trial. And just because between getting approval and trial could take a while as well. But they say this is stuff that they've said in the rulemaking, and the trial period could also include lab and field testing. So again, this is what happened with CBRS. We were lab tested. The Test Labs was an organization that works under the national NTIA called ITS, Institute for Telecommunication Science. And then field testing, where we will have, and then in CBRS, that field testing was called initial commercial deployment. So, that has all yet to be determined how long it's going to take, but we'll be in that. The commission will work with a multi-stakeholder group to develop the test and certification capability. The reason and cert is in brackets there is they only refer to testing, but there has to be a certification. So the experiences between TV whitespace and CBRS were vastly different. So who knows what this is going to look like. There are a lot of lessons learned from both, so we'll have to see, but the multi-stakeholder group will probably work on that. The AFC operators will have to demonstrate that access points will not interfere with incumbents, at least access points that obviously are on the AFC. So that'll probably happen in the field testing, or it could actually even happen in the lab, or some sort of non-live microwave testing. So we'll have to see how that happens. The FCC said they'll select multiple AFCs. Pretty much anybody that submits an AFC app that can spell AFC will probably get selected. The commission has never down-selected such applicants in the various opportunities they've done, even some that are not quite the same, like, for example, 70 to 90 or others. The other thing they've said, and again, this was consistent with TV whitespace and CBRS, that you can split the functions. So it could be that you say, well, I only want to be the database provider, or I only want to do this, or I only want to do that. As long as you can come in with a cogent application showing what you can do, you could do that. That hasn't been done yet, but their commission would allow it. The term is 5 years, and it's renewable. That's the way it is with everything right now, the 5-year term. SAS is a 5-year term. TV whitespace was a 5-year term, and which is automatically renewable for the most part. And then finally, the commission allows us to charge fees, but the commission said that they will have oversight on the fee. So for the multi-stakeholder group, the commission was rather clear on at least what they wanted the multi-stakeholder group to work on, a little more murky on what the multi-stakeholder group looks like. And one of the reasons is that there were really 2 multi-stakeholder groups that have been working on this. One is the Wireless Innovation Forum, called the WIN Forum, and the other, there's a Wi-Fi Alliance, which we refer to as WFA. And so both of those organizations had been working on this. So when the commission and the WIN Forum did a lot of, and did all of the standards work on the SAS for CBRS. And the WIN Forum was also involved with the TV whitespace. So the WIN Forum has a lot of experience. And then the AFC people, or the Wi-Fi Alliance, the WFA, have been working very closely with the licensed community, almost exclusively the Wi-Fi people, hence Wi-Fi Alliance. So the commission, but they didn't want to give one of these groups or the other any reign over this. So the commission said, well, let's form a new multi-stakeholder group. The idea probably will be more along the lines of these 2 multi-stakeholder groups coming together, but we'll have to see what happens. In any case, primarily they want us to work on the interference detection and mitigation, security measures, test and certification procedures, basic requirements for the AFC, and then how the AFCs have complete and up-to-date incumbent data, even using the ULS. And most of those that have worked with the ULS in the past know that the ULS is not that easy to work with. So ensuring that we have exact and up-to-date incumbent data is not trivial. And then they want to make sure that the multi-stakeholder group has all of these representatives, including wireless service providers, network operators, AFC operators, potential AFC operators, the fixed service vendors and operators, the 6 gig licensees, and then other parties with an interest. So basically anybody that wants to be involved should be involved. And the OET will act as a liaison, probably similar to the way the Wireless Bureau will act as a liaison with CBRS, as they actually gave us somebody that participated in many of the discussions. This is yet to come together. There's conversations going on now among the stakeholders, so there should be clarity on this shortly. This is sort of a model of what this should look like. It could, Could be that not exactly like this. It could be the WinForum, as you see in the upper right, and the Wi-Fi Alliance right below it might just collaborate. But all of these entities would be participating. Probably some more so than others. So, for example, the incumbents, they have certainly an active stake in here. The OEMs and chipset manufacturers, certainly are going to want to know what these look like, but they may be able to participate either through the Wi-Fi Alliance or through some other organization. But this is a model, what it could look like. We think it'll look more like the WinForum and Wi-Fi Alliance collaborating, but we'll have to see. But you see at the top there, the OET. Here is the timeline. This is a fairly aggressive timeline we put together, but you see that consumer low power access points could come out as early as the end of next year. Actually, it could be, the end of this year into 2021. The further notice, the comments are due on that on July 27th, I believe. And the deadline for filing petitions for recon on the further notice is June 27th, I believe. I'm sorry, on the report and order. Then we think that the multi-stakeholder group will get its act together and start working on process definition that will take us into early next year. I would actually slide that out probably into the first half of next year. Then we'll see low power indoor and the phones and laptops by the first quarter of 2021, maybe on into the second quarter. Enterprise low power and access points within the first quarter. That probably could happen. Then the AFC beginning the second half of 2021 into the first quarter of 2022. That's pretty aggressive, but very aggressive. That's probably best case. And then all the other stuff you see happening out toward 2022. And that actually, this is the U.S. timeline. There's another timeline for the rest of the world, which is a little bit delayed. Some of them are not using the same approach we're doing, so that's why we didn't put it on. The microwave incumbents, here's just a little information on the current usage. These are counts that we did just to identify the usage for pretty much where all the operations are occurring in CONUS, in the Gulf, Alaska, Hawaii, and territory. So this is really much everything that's in operation. And you can see for all the bands, there's over 106,000, almost 107,000 frequency assignments, and 50,000, almost 51,000 call signs. And it's you could pretty much equivocate or equal call sign to a site. Then there are about 46,000 microwave links across all the band segments, with the heaviest concentration being in Uni 5 and 7. And then some of it being up in Uni 8. You remember, I didn't mention this when I showed the band plan, but the what would be equivalent of Uni 7 and 8 were the old 6 gigahertz, 6.7 gig private operational fixed. And most may remember that the 6 gig band is the last band available for long-haul microwave. A lot of what's in the 6 gig band has been relocated out of the 1.9 gig band back in the 90s for PCS, and then the 2.1 gig band in the early 2000s for AWS. So there's really no other band for long-haul microwave, so that's why this band is there's a lot of usage. And you can see the classifications. Most of this stuff is in rural areas. Some stuff is in heavy urban, so these are links coming down into downtown areas. So anyhow, these are the usage stats that people can look at and cogitate over. We broke these down also by market just to get a sense of for deployment considerations, like maybe for 3GPP, 5G deployments, or for even unlicensed deployments. And so the number one market is the LA market. DC sits down there. I'm not even sure what that number is, but that 8 is the rank order of the CMA. But within the top 20 CMAs, there's 10,000 paths. So roughly a quarter of all the paths in there, a little more than a quarter, are in the top 20 CMAs. So it stands to reason that we'll need to be dealing with the AFC in these areas for standard power access points, certainly indoors and possibly outdoors, quite a bit. For the other portions of the band, the mobile intent fixed, these, if you recall, are for like local television transmission service or studio TV pickup, studio transmitter links, and the like. These are all microwave or microwave-like. Some of these are mobile, and these are based on just fixed licenses in the ULS. But you can see in the Uni 6 and 8, there's a total of 134 licenses, 440 frequency assignments. So it's not a ton. This is again in the top 20. So the total number of frequency assignments across all the band is 1,231. So that's still, and you might expect that because these are areas where you're taking information from the studio out to the transmitter or supporting ENG or electronic news gathering. So there is a fair amount of activity here. And these are the ones for which the AFC is going to be a little complex for standard. Worth noting that standard power doesn't happen in that portion. So some of the concerns of the microwave industry that as we've picked up, certainly whether or not there's adequate protection of microwave systems. Most in the microwave industry feel like there's not. So we encourage the microwave industry to participate primarily with the WIN Forum or the Wi-Fi Alliance if you can join, but in the multi-stakeholder discussion to make sure that your interests are properly represented. The other concern that we've seen is the ability to freely deploy and operate microwave systems. I spoke to some folks not long ago that thought by virtue of this rulemaking it meant there would be no more 6 gig microwave, and that's not true. So just to make clear, the use of the 6 gig band for microwave proceeds as it always has. There are not going to be any changes. You don't have to worry about the AFC. At least, you should probably concern yourself that the AFC works properly, but at least in terms of operating on the AFC, that doesn't apply to you in any else. You should still be able to freely deploy and operate microsystems consistent with the rules. There is concern of the suitability of the ULS to support the AFC. Most are aware the ULS is not an engineering database, it's a regulatory database. So as I said earlier, there are some data fields which are either unsupported or unfilled in. Things like line loss or that sort of thing. For example, radio information. Some of the systems, some of the license records have radio information, some of them don't. So what we're going to have to do is calculate the threshold, and we'll have to calculate that based on the radio transmission bandwidth, not necessarily the receive bandwidth of the radio. No information on noise figure, so calculating the threshold, we'll have to either make assumptions on noise figure or try to find that data some other way. So there is a big concern on the suitability of the ULS, not the least of which is the accuracy of the ULS. So you will be seeing public notices coming out asking licensees to update their license records, which I mentioned. Testing and certification of the AFCs, incumbents want it exhaustive, as rightfully so and understood. So that the testing program will have to be pretty comprehensive. Absolutely concerned about potential for interference from non-FCC controlled low power indoor devices. The bulk of the filings that contained analysis was around that potential issue. Most people were comfortable with standard power access points given that they would be managed by the AFC. So with low power being not managed, there is substantial concern that there is potential for interference, and so there's still filings going on. Another concern is interference identification and remediation. How is that going to work? What is the role of the AFCs? What is the role of multi-stakeholder group? Who do incumbents call when there's interference? So that's a big question for which there's really no answer, so just stay tuned. Also, microwave licensees don't want a burden placed on the incumbents. You want to be able to freely deploy your microwave systems as it relates to the second bullet. So no burdens or anything on incumbents. You want to be able to make sure you can deploy your systems for which there's no interference. And then concerns about the future of the band. Some are arguing that this is sort of a de facto takeover of the band, and we can certainly understand that. We are working with the NTIA and others on examining the feasibility of opening the 7125 to 8500 meg band for use in what they call bidirectional sharing. That is in the very early stages. There's no guarantees it'll ever happen, certainly not quickly if it does. But there may be an opportunity. And the other thing is maybe think about whether or not your microwave path is short enough that it could go into other bands on your own, either the 11 gig band or that's probably the only other band that could support it. So those are the concerns. So what are the next steps? What can you do to prepare for the oncoming 6 gig unlicensed stuff? So the first thing to do is to verify that your data is correct in the ULS. As I said earlier, the ULS is going to be the database we use primarily to determine locations and configurations of microwave systems. That's the database the Commission has told us to use. And so you need to make sure that your data are correct in there. We're expecting the Commission to issue a public notice giving licensees some time to update their data. That should be coming anytime soon, well, anytime in the next few months. So, make sure you review the data and make corrections and updates as needed. The other thing to do is get engaged and get active. There's several multi-stakeholder groups going right now. The one that we're involved with that's helped driving some of these requirements for the AFC is called the Wireless Innovation Forum, or the WIN Forum. As I mentioned earlier in the deck, the Commission is relying upon multi-stakeholder groups to help with the requirements for the AFC, as well as how to deal with enforcement maybe not enforcement, how to deal with interference. So you participate in any of them. UTC and several other utility companies or utilities associations are members of the WIN Forum. FWCC is a member of the WIN Forum. But you could join either of them or join the WIN Forum. But the WIN Forum is working with the Wi-Fi Alliance to develop a roadmap on how to move forward. So, and if you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. And then finally, monitor your microwave systems for any increase in interference. And that will manifest typically as an increase in bit error rate. At times that don't usually occur with fading. It could certainly happen with fading, but generally it could be also anti-correlated to fading. So just monitor your microwave systems for any interference. And if you see any issues, feel free to give us a call. Probably the primary person to call on this is Greg Macy. Greg Macy is managing the group that does the frequency coordination, and his colleague Ali Abbas manages the group to go out and measure interference. So between Greg and Ali, they can certainly help to make sure that you can follow these 4 steps. But in addition, so here's how he can help. We have a 3-step process to help get you ready for unlicensed systems coming in. As we said in the first slide, the previous slide, the first thing is to monitor your data or check your data so that we can do a data auditing program for you, where we will look at the data that's in the ULS, compare that to the data that we have in our databases and coordinated information, and identify where there are any issues in the ULS for your systems. Those could be location errors, it could be antenna sighting errors, it could be radio errors, any one of many things. So we can do that. We can do a full audit and then let you know what's missing or what's an error, and then tell you how to correct it. Included in the corrective actions could be even coordination. If we have to re-coordinate a link just because the change may be greater than what would be considered a minor change, we can do that for you. We can update the database, the ULS, with licensing information, and take all corrective actions needed to make sure the data in the ULS reflects exactly what's going on with your system. And then finally, if there's interference, we can undertake a mitigation program. The first thing you might want to do is get a baseline. So we could go out and do measurements of, for over a period of time of the baseline bit error rate and frame error rate. And then you can have that, and should you see those values begin to erode, then we can come back and do measurements to identify the potential for interference. We think the interference resolution part that the Commission was referring to in the rulemaking will depend a lot on this type of measurements. So that's the 3-step program we can undertake. If you have any questions on that at all, feel free to call Greg, and he can help you with that. So that's the deck. Thank you very much for participating and listening. We hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions at all, you can contact me. There's my contact information, and my phone number is 703-585-6249, and you can contact Greg. His contact information is 2 slides before this. So good luck, stay safe, and let us know if you have any questions at all. Thank you.